Good afternoon. I told the speakers that we'd change the format a bit. We'd give them all about 2 minutes to just mention one suggestion, one proposal, one observation, one criticism. And then when we go through that, we'll go by another round. Either they can react to something that one of the other panelists said, or they can ask a question of one of the other panelists. I've also told them not to all gang up on the court administrator, Midas Marquez. Okay, so I think the general topic is how to make the Philippines more competitive, attract more investment, whether that's by making us safe from violence, from terrorism, making the judicial system and the contract system more stable, less risk. Also, making Filipinos more competitive by providing for their health and education. I think that covers our whole group here today. Let's begin with Ambassador Donald Dee. 2 minutes for an observation, a criticism, a proposal.
Thank you, Coco. Well, previous speakers have already said that competitiveness, we have to start with the elements of cost, and therefore we really have to work on our power costs and our social policies, the labor policies, which I think will be handled by Ed here. But beyond that, having put so much time because of Bill Luz in the National Competitiveness Council, I think that what we would like to see happen this year is that we are able to better coordinate the various agencies of government so that we can really bring down the proposals of the various sectors as we prepare the roadmaps. But beyond that, I also have a request for all of you that shortly you will be receiving survey forms coming from the NCC, and I hope that we will get better than 3% reply rates. Unless we get your inputs, it is almost impossible for us to come out with the proper recommendations.
Okay, ECOP President Ed Lacson.
Thank you, Coco. ECOP stands for so many advocacies, and we are very appreciative that we were invited in the National Competitiveness Council this year because the previous NCC did not pay too much attention to labor. Labor is one big component in production, and right now I would like only to mention 3 major advocacies that we are undertaking right now. One is to rationalize the 1974 Labor Code, which is already archaic and non-competitive because of the globalized economy. That code has already undergone 58 amendments, which themselves also need amendments. And there are several stray laws outside the code that also need to be corrected. One is the wage fixing system, because in our country, this is the only country where there are 3 certainties. They say there are only 2, debt, taxes, but the increase in minimum wage is a very certain event. Our wage fixing system is legislated, and we are saying it should be productivity-based and it should be market-driven. Our code is also the only labor law in the whole world that imprisons employers if they violate the code. I hope our court administrator will take note of that. We are not risking only capital, we risk our liberty when we go into business. The non-diminution clause of salaries, wages, and benefits. This is the only country in the world where the salaries and wages defy the law of gravity. Once you raise, you can never bring it down. So it does not match the economic conditions in the whole world. It is too rigid and too inflexible. The ease of hiring and firing employees. Before martial law, we had an employment at will policy, which means we can hire, we can fire, but we should compensate. But now it is just cause. And to even aggravate this, there are pending bills to make employment perpetual. This is the security of tenure bill. Even without that bill, under the present code, it is easier to divorce your wife than to dismiss an employee. That is true. And we don't even have a divorce law. And if you fire an employee and you lose, you get 2 years imprisonment. But if you divorce your wife and you lose, you get back your wife. I don't know which is worse. I told that to my wife and she was not amused. We also have the labor justice reform. This is the only country in the world where the labor justice has no jurisprudence. The same case, different characters, different judgment. So we need to establish jurisprudence. Our labor justice should also be established on an equitable, impartial, consistent, and prompt basis. The system of dismissing employee has to be reformed because once you lose in the NLRC level, you are given 2 options: to reinstate physically or to reinstate by payroll. If you reinstate by payroll and you win in the Supreme Court after 20 years, but you keep on paying the employee for 20 years, I doubt if you can get back what you paid him.
Mr. Lacson, do you mind if we move ahead and then we'll come back to your points?
Okay.
Thank you very much. Mr. Romeo Bernardo.
Thank you. I'm supposed to talk about the macroeconomy, but it's really been quite good, except for IMF. IMF is mostly fiscal. and really, during the time of Mr. Bobby De Ocampo, the tax ratio was 16 to 17% of GDP. It's now still stuck at 12.5. Now, while the BIR is doing its share and seems to be meeting its objectives, there's a lot to be said about the Bureau of Customs, which has a shortfall now. And if that happened during our time, the Customs Commissioner, Willie Paraino, would not have stayed 1 day longer. It's 56 billion and growing at something like accelerating. This is the Arangkada part, at about 10 billion every month. So this is in the face of about 5,000 containers that are unaccounted for. I guess still very rampant news about continuous oil smuggling. So to me, this is an important area, and I can talk about some concrete things for customs, but we really don't have time. I think leadership is important. I think we need a seasoned veteran there, like Mr. Paraino, for example. And this is no endorsement for him. I'm sure he doesn't want the job. But somebody like him, because I understand the gremlins are having the run of the place. Number 2, more long-term. The moment, if you're really interested in pursuing this infrastructure program and safety nets, once government starts learning how to spend properly, and which we hope will happen this year, we will realize a fiscal problem. And the only way to address that would be through well-studied legislation to reform the sin taxes, to reform fiscal incentives. So that has to be done. And if I still have 30 seconds, on debt management and export competitiveness is so important. If government borrowed more domestically, then it will be sucking up some of the dollars as we have to repay some of the maturing dollar debt. So there will be a more competitive exchange rate if we borrowed less from abroad. I think this is something that there's still room to do, and I hope our Department of Finance and Central Bank move more in tandem in order to do this. That's
Thanks.
it.
Thank you, Romy. Next is Rommel Banlaoi. He is the Executive Director of the Philippine Institute for Peace, Violence, and Terrorism Research. Rommel.
Okay, I will only focus on one policy on security, and that's our national security policy. And for the first time in the entire history of our country, this government was able to come out with a black and white document articulating our national security policy covering the period 2011 to 2016. It aims to sustain our gains in democracy, and it aims to fulfill the social contract of this government, particularly Pinoy, to the Filipino people. Unfortunately, this is my observation. Now we have a policy. Now where is the strategy? The strategy should lead us to where we're going to. Without a strategy, we will get lost in the forest. It's like a compass. If we don't have a compass to go to the forest, then we will get lost in the forest. We have a Philippine medium-term development plan that devotes the entire chapter on security. Now we have a plan, we have a policy, then where's the strategy? Maybe the strategy is still in the minds of our government officials, but we want to know it. We want to know the strategy so that we know what this nation is going to. So far, we have a relatively stable external security environment despite the ongoing tensions in the Sprat list. The Philippine greater security problem is largely internal because we have many non-state armed groups. Namely, we have the New People's Army, the lawless elements of More Islamic Liberation Front, we have the Abu Sayyaf group, we have the Rahaw Sulaiman Islamic Movement, and other residual armed groups associated with the rogue elements of Moro National Liberation Front. Now, maybe you have heard about the Al-Kubar group. Now, the newly established armed groups like the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Movement of Amaril Umbrakato, and the Auliya group of freedom fighters. Links of some of these armed groups with Al-Qaeda and Jemaah Islamiyah compound the nature of already complicated internal security threats confronting our country. Proliferation of private armed groups involved not only in political violence but also in criminal activities around the country also contributes to internal security problems. Some followers of non-state armed groups continue to wage arms because they find it enterprising to do so. They are violent entrepreneurs with strong economic agendas to perpetrate armed violence through extortions, kidnap for ransom, arms smuggling, drug trafficking, illegal gambling, illegal logging, illegal mining, name it, and most recently, bombers for hire. These violent entrepreneurs make huge money in an underground violent economy. Now, we need a strategy how to address this. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rommel. Next is Vince Lazatin. He is the head of the Transparency and Accountability Network.
Thank you, Coco. Good afternoon, everyone. I was very tempted to talk about judicial reform, but I don't want to give Midas Marquez indigestion, and I'll leave it to him to talk about judicial reform. I did tell Coco, however, that I get first dibs to ask Midas some questions about judicial reform. When we talk about governance, I think the first-year assessment of Arangkada touched on a lot of issues that have to be addressed as far as governance is concerned. The current administration has been very good about being transparent and putting information out in the hands of the public. And so I won't talk much about that. What the first-year assessment didn't touch on, which I think is very important when we talk about governance, is Philippine politics. And it may be beyond the mandated jurisdiction of the Joint Foreign Chambers to talk about politics, but politics in the Philippines is something that we have to address very seriously. And I talk specifically about the need for campaign finance reform and political party reform. They say that political parties in the Philippines are basically events organizers. They organize around events that happen every 3 years, which are elections. And between elections, nothing much happens in terms of building political parties and building support at the grassroots for political parties. So this has to change. And I think a serious political reform bill, campaign finance bill, has to really be put on the table as an agenda item of this administration. In 2007 and 2010, Perat Politica, a consortium of different groups, did studies to monitor campaign spending. The finding was that, first of all, it wasn't the politician or the candidate who spent the most that won. So that was one finding. But one of the key findings was that almost all candidates overspent, and not by 10%, not by 50%, not even just by 100%. There were candidates who overspent by 5,000% over the statutory limit. And this is a cause for concern because we know that when elected, these politicians will find a way to make that money back and get a return on their investment. And this is at the root of a lot of the corruption that occurs in this country. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Vince. Midas Marquez is the administrator of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, thank you, Coco, and thank you for reminding the panelists not to gang up on me.
They all want first dibs on you.
Okay. Anyway, I've remained true to my promise to Mr. Bill Luz earlier that I'd behave when the president was here. So, I behaved. Anyway, let me just assure everyone that despite the interesting times, our courts, including the Supreme Court, continue to function. The Supreme Court continue to have the regular sessions, both en banc and divisions, and they continue to address the cases pending before the courts. And more so in our regular courts, our lower courts. We also in the judiciary are one with you, with all of you, in providing an environment for sustainable development. And we are ready to listen and to partner with any sector towards that goal. We have done this in the past, and we can do this again anytime. Also, on our part, despite various challenges, we continue to find ways and means to expedite the resolution of cases pending both in the Supreme Court and in our lower courts. We have committees in the court which look into this regularly, and we also do consultations with different sectors. We have the Justice Sector Coordinating Council. We're very much part of it in improving our judicial system. And we welcome all recommendations and suggestions. Just one last point on graft and corruption. We need all of you to address this concern. We alone in the courts cannot rid our courts of graft and corruption without your help. So we need all your help. And when I say that, we need you to tell us these instances of graft and corruption concerning our judges and lower court employees. And we assure you that once we hear from you, we will act on these complaints right away. Thank you.
Thank you, Midas. Next up is Ms. Corazon Claudio of the Law of Nature Foundation.
As my friends here know, this is a subject that I feel very passionate about. And so I scribbled some notes so that I will be focused and give my co-panelists here the time to say their piece. I will say half of this, and I will explain the other half with recommendations and course of action later. In the environment and disaster preparedness areas, we face challenges that do not only present problems that we tend to focus on, but also offer great opportunities for us to move forward and have the future that we want. In the near future, not in 100 years, as Bobby fears. The last phrase, to have the future we want, is the title of a paper that is expected to come out of the next World Summit, Rio Plus 20 in Rio de Janeiro in June 2012. Green economy, the theme of Rio Plus 20, is what we must aim for. And let me define it as it is defined in the UN documents. It's the type of economy that is sustainable, that protects and enhances our natural resource base, increases resource efficiency, promotes sustainable consumption and production patterns, and moves our country toward low carbon development. There are many steps that we must continue to take or start to take to achieve green economy. First, we must continue to act on the previous recommendations of this forum. But actually, if you will look at those recommendations, they can be dispensed with simply by implementing existing laws and rules and regulations, such as those on solid waste, air, and water. But that is not the government's action alone. We must all participate in that effort. And I will propose what I have been proposing for many years to my colleagues in the business community. We have to apply SIMBI, start in my backyard, with TLC, not so much tender loving care only, but top management commitment by leading by example in caring for our environment. We must do that, but we must also take new initiatives, and many of those are offered by the opportunities behind our problems, and I will cite some examples later. Opportunities abound behind the problems in air, water, waste, land use, and other environmental concerns. The other point that I'd like to make is on disaster preparedness. Climate change is the single most important risk that we face because it is the one that can wipe us out of the world map. If you will Google IDRC Singapore, you will see there a map that shows that all regions of the Philippines are highly vulnerable to climate change. How do we prepare for it? Adaptation and mitigation measures. We are not a major emitter, so we must focus on adaptation measures, which include preparedness. But we need to do it more scientifically. As of now, how do we prepare, for example, for earthquakes? We do earthquake drills. This is an exercise that I think is not too useful unless we have already done the two more important initial steps, risk communication and risk assessment. And our recommendation there is for us to do risk assessment rigorously for every local community that will produce a risk profile. And I will explain that a little bit more. The third point is on land management. All of these efforts on green economy and on disaster preparedness are affected by what is happening on our land, how we are managing our land, how we are using our land. And it's about time that we have to do something about rationalizing land administration in the country. And I will explain that a little bit more later.
Thank you very much, Ms. Claudio.